I remember the exact moment the world slipped away, the moment my breath betrayed me, and the air turned into a weight that crushed my lungs. It was late October in Ashland, Oregon, a town where the fog crawls low and thick over the pines, and the night swallowed the daylight like a silent predator. I was driving home from my shift at the clinic, the road empty except for the occasional rustling of leaves caught in the wind. The streetlights flickered weakly through the mist, casting long, fractured shadows that danced just beyond the reach of my headlights. The smell of damp earth mixed with the cold bite of approaching winter. I felt at first, a flicker of dizziness, like the world wavered on the edge of a blade. My heart faltered, skipping beats, and then the silence came. Not the silence of peace, but the void, an absence of sound, color, and time. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47 p.m. for what felt like eternity. I didn't crash the car. Somehow, my body stayed upright, pressed against the seatbelt that suddenly felt like a noose. My eyes fluttered, the edges darkening, and I was falling, or maybe rising, into nothingness. Then, there was the light. Not the warm, comforting light of a sunset or a candle flame, but a cold, infinite radiance that stretched beyond space and time. It wasn't light as I knew it. It was something else, a presence. An invitation. That's when I saw him. He stood just beyond the threshold of that light, a figure both terrifying and oddly familiar. His form was slender and tall, but not human. His skin shimmered like glass, reflecting the void behind him in fractured patterns, like shards of forgotten memories. His eyes were the deepest black, but inside them swirled stars, galaxies collapsing and rebirthing in slow motion. I wanted to look away, but my gaze was locked, drawn to him like a moth to an impossible flame. Without words, he spoke, not in sounds, but in thoughts, raw and vivid, flooding my mind with images and sensations I couldn't begin to describe. It was a language of emotion and truth, cutting through the fog of my fading consciousness. He showed me a world unraveling, not through war or disaster, but through silence and fracture. He revealed the fractures in reality itself, like cracks spiderwebbing through the fabric of existence. Cities melting into shadows, people losing their reflections, memories bleeding out like water from a broken vessel. Prepare, he conveyed, not for the end you expect, but for the awakening you fear. And then, as suddenly as he appeared, the light receded. My breath rushed back in violent gasps. The fog was still there, the night still cold, but nothing would ever be the same. I didn't know then what I had seen, or what it meant. But I knew one thing, my life was broken into two halves, before the light, and after the light. When I finally opened my eyes, I was still sitting in the driver's seat. The fog had thickened outside, swallowing the road in a dense, unyielding gray. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, the taste of metal sharp on my tongue. I glanced at the clock again, 11:48 p.m. Just 1 minute had passed, and yet everything felt fractured, like time itself had cracked under the pressure. I wanted to convince myself it was a fainting spell, a trick of the mind born from exhaustion. But my heart knew better. It thudded with an unfamiliar rhythm, slower, heavier, as if it carried a secret too dark to speak aloud. For days afterward, the world around me seemed off-kilter. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in the daylight. The trees outside my window no longer rustled with the same warmth, their branches twisted like blackened fingers reaching for something unseen. I caught fleeting glimpses of faces in crowds that weren't quite human, or maybe they were, but distorted by some invisible filter that warped their eyes into hollow voids. I stopped going to work. The sterile white walls of the clinic became suffocating, each beep of the machines like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together fragments of the vision, the shards of cosmic storms swirling in those impossible eyes, the whispered warnings that rippled through my mind. Late one night, unable to bear the silence, I took a walk through Lithia Park, a place I had always found solace in. The fog had turned the familiar paths into labyrinths of shadow and light, and the air smelled of damp moss and forgotten secrets. I reached the edge of the small pond and looked into its glassy surface. For a moment, my reflection stared back, then it fractured, splitting into a dozen fragmented images, each one whispering a different truth I wasn't ready to hear. I realized then that the man, or whatever he was, hadn't just shown me a future. He had planted a seed of unease, a shadow within my own soul that would grow whether I wanted it or not. The world was changing. Not with the clamor of chaos, but with the slow, inevitable pull of something ancient and unseen. Something that had been waiting, watching, just beyond the edge of human perception. And I was the only one who knew. The days blurred into one another, each dawn peeling back layers of unease I couldn't shake. Ashland had always been a town of quiet rhythms, the gentle hum of daily life tucked beneath the towering pines and rolling hills. But now, even the familiar seemed alien, as if the town itself was holding its breath. One morning, I found myself drawn to the local library, a place I hadn't visited in years. Maybe it was the need for answers, or simply to escape the claustrophobic silence of my apartment. The scent of aged paper and dust felt oddly grounding. As I wandered the aisles, my fingers tracing the spines of books, I noticed something strange, symbols carved into the wooden shelves, faint but deliberate. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. I pulled out a leather-bound volume on local folklore and myth. The pages were brittle, filled with stories of shadow creatures and celestial watchers. One passage caught my eye. In the spaces between light and dark, the veil thins. Eyes that are not our own watch silently, waiting for the world to awaken. A shiver ran down my spine. The words echoed the message from the man, the visitor, the presence I couldn't explain. I wasn't imagining it. Something was happening beneath the surface of reality, threads unraveling in ways no one else could see. Later that day, as twilight bled into night, I walked through downtown Ashland. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few lingering souls. I saw it then, a flicker in the sky, like a star blinking out of sync. The air pulsed with a low hum, almost imperceptible, but enough to raise the hairs on my arms. I wasn't alone in sensing the shift. But how do you explain something that defies logic? To friends, I became a ghost of myself, distracted, distant, haunted. They told me to rest, to get back to normal. But there was no going back. I kept seeing his eyes, the vast cosmos swirling in their depths, whenever I closed mine. They held a terrible promise: the world I knew was dissolving, replaced by something else, something primal. And I was left standing on the threshold, caught between two worlds, the one slipping away, and the one creeping quietly forward. The nights grew heavier. Sleep became a battleground where dreams and reality blurred into indistinguishable shadows. Every time I closed my eyes, I was pulled back to that cold light, the infinite radiance, and to him, standing just beyond the veil. But the visitation wasn't silent anymore. The thoughts he sent grew louder, more urgent, filled with images I couldn't forget. I saw cities folding in on themselves, streets twisting like ribbons into endless loops. I saw people walking through walls of glass, their faces empty, reflections shattered like broken mirrors. I saw a sky that cracked open, bleeding stars into the void. I tried to write it down, to capture the fragments before they dissolved, but words failed me. The language of that presence wasn't meant for human tongues. It was a symphony of fear, hope, and inevitability, a message encoded in symbols and sensations. One evening, I wandered back to the pond in Lithia Park. The surface was unnaturally still, like black glass. As I stared into the water, I noticed ripples spreading from the center, though no wind stirred the air. Then, I saw it, a symbol etched beneath the water's surface. It was the same as those in the library, an ancient glyph pulsing with a faint, otherworldly light. The pond seemed to breathe, drawing me closer with a silent invitation. I reached out my hand, trembling, and the water's chill bit into my skin like a warning. In that moment, I understood, the fractures weren't just breaking the world around me. They were breaking me, too. The veil was thinning, and what waited beyond was no longer patient. Days passed like restless ghosts. The world around me seemed to pulse with a hidden rhythm, a heartbeat beneath the fabric of reality that I alone could hear. I stopped trying to explain. Words were futile against the creeping certainty gnawing at my mind. One afternoon, I found myself wandering near Emigrant Lake, a place I hadn't visited since childhood. The water stretched wide and dark beneath the gray sky, its surface rippling gently as if breathing in time with my own erratic pulse. I sat on the cold stone shore, letting the wind scrape against my skin, and listened. The silence wasn't empty, it was alive, humming with secrets. Then, the whispers began. Soft at first, like the rustle of leaves. Then clearer, shaped into fragmented voices calling from just beyond comprehension. They weren't words but feelings, sorrow, warning, desperation. I closed my eyes, and the voices grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. And then, a single phrase anchored itself deep within my mind, the breach widens. I opened my eyes to the lake's glassy surface and saw shadows moving beneath the water, shapes that didn't belong to fish or drifting debris. They were distorted, shifting forms, neither fully solid nor entirely vapor. A chill gripped my spine. I knew the truth, the world was breaking, unraveling at its edges. The fabric between realities was thinning, and those who waited beyond the veil were slipping through. I stood, the cold seeping into my bones, and whispered back, though no one could hear, "What do you want from us?" No answer came, only the endless ripple of the lake and the distant cry of a crow. The warning had come. Now, the real darkness was waiting. After that day by Emigrant Lake, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, not from a distance, but just beyond the veil of what I could see. My reflection in mirrors sometimes flickered, like a signal caught between channels. Shadows moved with a life of their own, and the air hummed with a silent warning. Then, one morning, I noticed it. A mark, faint but unmistakable, burned into my wrist. It wasn't a bruise or a rash. It was a symbol. The same glyph I had seen carved into the library shelves and beneath the surface of the pond. I traced it with trembling fingers. The skin was cool to the touch, and the edges glowed faintly in the dim light. Panic rose in my chest. Was this some sign of possession? A curse? Or a gift? I remembered his eyes, infinite, piercing, full of silent promises. The visitor had left something with me, something that tied me irrevocably to what was coming. I tried to hide the mark, covering it with sleeves and bracelets, but it pulsed beneath the fabric, a reminder that I was no longer just a witness. The days that followed brought nightmares unlike anything I had ever experienced. I dreamed of collapsing cities and skies ripped open like paper. I dreamed of faces without eyes, mouths whispering secrets in a language older than time. In my waking hours, the whispers persisted. Sometimes in the static of my radio, sometimes in the quiet crackle of the wind. Always the same message, seeping deeper into my mind: prepare. The threshold approaches. The line between reality and the unknown blurred with every passing hour. I was trapped between worlds, marked and waiting for a reckoning I could neither escape nor fully understand. The mark on my wrist was growing, though no one else could see it. Its glow was faint during the day, but at night, it pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, slow, steady, like a countdown. Sleep became a distant memory. Each time I closed my eyes, I was pulled into a world fractured and distorted. I wandered through twisted streets where shadows moved like living things, and the sky hung low, bruised with swirling colors that defied logic. In those dreams, or were they visions? I saw myself reflected in broken mirrors scattered across the landscape. Each shard showed a different version of me, scared, angry, resigned, and sometimes, terrifyingly calm. The reflections whispered secrets, fragments of the visitor's message that I couldn't piece together. Back in the waking world, the townspeople of Ashland were changing too. I noticed subtle shifts, a man in the grocery store who spoke in riddles, a child who stared at me with eyes too old for her face. They seemed to be waking from some shared dream, their masks slipping. One evening, I met with an old friend, Mark, who had always been skeptical of anything beyond the material world. I tried to tell him about the mark, the visions, the visitor. He looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. "Maybe you're under too much stress," he said gently. "Maybe you need a break." But I knew it wasn't that simple. The visitor had shattered something inside me, a crack that couldn't be sealed. As I left the cafe, the night air bit at my skin, and I saw it again, a flicker of movement in the shadows, just beyond the streetlight's reach. I wasn't alone. And the world I knew was slipping away, piece by piece. The days that followed felt like walking through a haze. Every familiar sound was distorted, every face held a secret I couldn't decipher. The mark on my wrist pulsed faintly under my skin, a silent metronome counting down to something I dreaded but couldn't escape. I began to notice patterns, symbols appearing in places I had never seen before, carved subtly into tree bark along my morning walks, etched into the cracked paint of an old bench downtown, even in the smoke rings drifting from a homeless man's cigarette. They seemed to pulse with an energy that made my skin crawl. Sleep was no longer a refuge but a trap. Night after night, I found myself pulled back to that infinite light, to his eyes, swirling with galaxies and cold truths. His messages came clearer now, visions of reality fraying like a tapestry being unraveled thread by thread. Cities folding, skies bleeding stars, people dissolving into shadows. One evening, I sat alone in my apartment, the walls seeming to close in. The whispers filled the silence, no longer distant, but right beside me. They spoke of a breach, a thinning between worlds, and of an awakening that would consume everything. My phone buzzed, breaking the oppressive quiet. A message from an unknown number. "You are marked. You are chosen. The end is closer than you think." I stared at the screen, the weight of those words pressing down like a stone on my chest. No answers, only more questions. The visitor's warning was no longer a distant echo. It was here, now, unfolding in the shadows of this quiet town, in the spaces between breaths. And I was the only one who could see it coming. The mark on my wrist had become a living thing, a pulse beneath my skin, syncing with my every heartbeat, a reminder of the visitor's presence, both haunting and guiding. It was as if the boundary between my body and something else had blurred, a thin membrane vibrating with silent energy. I started seeing patterns everywhere. Not just the symbols, but moments where reality itself seemed to flicker, like a faulty projector showing fragments of another world bleeding through. Faces in crowds would momentarily distort, their expressions folding into something inhuman before snapping back. Shadows stretched longer, reaching for places they shouldn't touch. I withdrew from everyone. Friends, family, their voices felt distant, muffled behind an invisible barrier. How could I explain the growing chasm inside me when even I struggled to understand it? One night, I found myself back at the edge of the pond in Lithia Park. The water was unnervingly still, reflecting a sky that felt too dark, too heavy with meaning. The glyph beneath the surface glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat synced to my own. I whispered into the silence, "What are you? What do you want from me?" The water rippled, and the reflection warped into his eyes, those infinite galaxies, staring back with a calm that sent a shiver down my spine. The visitor wasn't just a messenger. He was a sentinel, a keeper of the thresholds between worlds. And I was marked to be part of something far greater than myself, a reckoning that would unravel the fabric of all things. Fear twisted inside me, but beneath it, a strange clarity grew. The world was breaking apart, yes, but maybe, in that fracture, there was a chance for something new to be born. I didn't know if I was ready. But there was no turning back now. By now, the line between what was real and what was not had become nearly invisible. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to breathe, every whisper carried meaning I could almost grasp but never quite hold. Sleep evaded me. When I did drift off, I was swallowed by visions darker than the night itself. I walked through corridors lined with mirrors that fractured my reflection into infinite shards. Each shard revealed a different version of myself, some screaming silently, others calm and resigned. I felt like a prisoner trapped within my own mind. The mark on my wrist pulsed relentlessly, a reminder that I was tethered to something beyond understanding. It was as if my very soul had been branded. At work, people's faces blurred at the edges. Conversations became echoes, words fading before they landed. I caught myself staring into the void during meetings, as if searching for answers hidden in the empty spaces between syllables. One evening, the visitor's presence seeped into my dreams more vividly than ever. His eyes filled with galaxies spiraled around me, pulling me into a cosmic dance of light and shadow. He showed me a vision of the earth, cracked, bleeding stars, cities dissolving into mist, and humanity lost in a silent spiral toward oblivion. But amidst the chaos, there was a spark, a thin line of light cutting through the darkness. A promise of awakening, if only we dared to face what was coming. I woke drenched in sweat, the weight of that promise heavy on my chest. The fracture in my mind was growing, but maybe it was also a doorway. I was standing on the edge of something terrible and something beautiful. I began to notice them, the watchers. At first, I thought they were figments of my fractured mind. Fleeting glimpses in the corner of my eye, shadows that lingered too long, figures standing just beyond the reach of streetlights. But they were real. I felt it in the marrow of my bones. They didn't move like humans. Their presence was quiet but insistent, like a cold wind slipping through cracks. Some nights, when the fog rolled thick over Ashland, I could hear their whispers, not in words, but in the heavy silence that pressed into my ears. They were waiting. The visitor had warned me, but I hadn't understood the meaning until now. The watchers were the sentinels of the breach, the silent observers of the world's unraveling. They were neither cruel nor kind, merely patient, like the tide rising slowly to drown the shore. I felt their gaze even in the most mundane moments, while waiting in line at the grocery store, while driving home under the starless sky. They were always there, threading through the edges of reality. One night, standing at my window, I saw a figure step out from the fog. It was tall and slender, shimmering faintly like glass, its eyes dark voids swirling with distant stars, the visitor's eyes. But this figure was different. It wasn't here to warn. It was here to watch. The world was no longer safe. The breach was widening, and those who dwelled beyond it were coming closer. I didn't know if I could stop it. But I knew I had to try. I felt it more acutely now, the pull of the threshold, like a tide dragging me toward a dark and unknowable shore. Every moment was stretched thin, like a thread about to snap. The mark on my wrist had changed. It no longer just pulsed beneath the skin, it burned faintly, like a slow fire, a constant reminder that I was tethered to something beyond the world I knew. At night, the visitor's presence invaded my dreams with increasing urgency. His eyes, swirling with galaxies, showed me visions of what was to come, not just destruction, but transformation. Cities swallowed by silence, skies cracked open like fractured glass, and something ancient stirring beneath the surface. I realized that the world was not ending, it was shifting. But shifts like this come with a price. The watchers I had seen were neither friends nor foes. They were guardians, standing sentinel at the boundary between what was and what might be. Their silent vigil was both warning and invitation. I tried to prepare, to understand my role in this cosmic unraveling. But the truth was elusive, like trying to grasp smoke with bare hands. And yet, in the deepest core of my fear, a strange hope flickered. Maybe the fracture was not just a breaking point, but a rebirth. I stood on the edge of the threshold, the veil thinning, and knew the moment to cross was approaching. I woke one morning feeling different. The air in my apartment felt charged, thick with the weight of unseen possibilities. The mark on my wrist no longer just burned, it thrummed, alive with a strange energy. I tried to ignore it, to keep living in the remnants of my old life. But the visitor's words echoed in my mind, prepare. The threshold approaches. That day, as I walked through the quiet streets of Ashland, the world around me seemed to warp subtly. The colors bled at the edges, sounds distorted like a radio tuned to a frequency just beyond reach. I caught sight of a shimmering door, or was it a veil? Flickering open between two ancient oaks in Lithia Park. It called to me, a silent invitation I couldn't resist. I reached out, and the air rippled beneath my fingers, like water disturbed. The veil parted, revealing a corridor of light and shadow stretching into infinity. Stepping through was like plunging into a dream where time and space lost meaning. I saw memories that were not mine, futures that twisted like labyrinths, and faces bathed in starlight. And then I saw him, the visitor, waiting at the end, his eyes vast with unspoken knowledge. He spoke without words, the world was unraveling, but in the fracture lay a choice. To cling to the crumbling past, or to step boldly into the unknown. I felt the weight of that choice settle over me, cold and sharp. The threshold was no longer a boundary, it was a door. And I had to decide whether to cross. The corridor of light stretched endlessly before me, a liminal space where time folded like paper and every step echoed with the weight of possibility. I felt myself dissolving, unmoored from the familiar anchors of my life, my home, my fears, my memories. The visitor's eyes held me in their vastness, galaxies swirling in their depths like ancient storms. Without words, he showed me the two paths ahead. One was the past, the world I knew, fracturing and crumbling, bound by fear and denial. Clinging to it meant watching everything fade into shadow, trapped in cycles of pain and decay. The other was the unknown, a realm beyond understanding, shimmering with light and shadow intertwined. It was terrifying and beautiful, promising both destruction and rebirth. I realized the fracture was not just a breaking, it was a choice. The world was a living thing, its fate tied to the choices of those who dared to see beyond the veil. I hesitated, my heart a storm of doubt and hope. To cross meant losing everything I was, but perhaps, in that loss, finding something more. The visitor's presence was patient yet insistent. The threshold awaited. And so, with a breath that felt like both an end and a beginning, I stepped forward. Crossing the threshold was like plunging into a void both infinite and intimate. Time stretched and folded, past, present, and future merged into a single, shimmering moment. I was everywhere and nowhere, a thread in the vast tapestry of existence unraveling and rewoven at once. The visitor's eyes guided me, revealing truths too immense for language, the fragile fragility of reality, the dance of light and shadow that forms worlds, and the delicate balance that now trembled on the edge. I saw Earth not as a planet, but as a living being, breathing, shifting, wounded yet still full of potential. The fracture was its pain and its call to transformation. And I understood then, I was not just a witness but a catalyst. The mark on my wrist was a symbol of that connection, a bridge between the fading world and the emerging one. Fear didn't disappear, but it was tempered by a strange clarity, an acceptance of the unknown. The visitor's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed a hint of compassion in those endless stars. I was ready to return, to face whatever came with open eyes and a steady heart. Because the future was no longer a shadow to fear. It was a realm to enter, bravely, unafraid. I opened my eyes to the first light of dawn filtering through the window. The world around me felt different, quieter, yet charged with a subtle energy. The mark on my wrist had faded to a soft glow, no longer a burning brand but a gentle pulse, a reminder of the journey I had taken beyond the veil. Ashland was still here, still fragile, but I saw it now with new eyes. The fractures were not just cracks in reality, but openings, doorways to possibilities unseen. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, feeling the weight of uncertainty, but also a quiet hope blossoming within me. The visitor's message echoed softly in my mind, prepare. The threshold approaches. But now I understood, the threshold was not an end, but a beginning. The world was not doomed. It was transforming. And I, marked and changed, was part of that transformation. With every breath, I embraced the unknown, the fragile, terrifying, beautiful realm of near realms where fear and hope intertwine. I was no longer afraid. I was awake. And the new dawn was ours to meet.